For years, he was undeniably the best player in Fortnite, winning 5 FNCSs on EU and earning over $1 million all within a short time span. But now, despite still consistently playing, nobody even has him in their top 10. Most of you know exactly who I'm talking about, and that's Tayson. There's few who even have half the achievements of him, but to go from winning everything to struggling to place, even with the best players in the world by his side, all within a few months, leaves us with the question, what exactly happened to Tayson? In order to answer this question, we need to see how he became the GOAT of competitive Fortnite in the first place. Tayson has been gaming since he was very young and didn't originally begin with Fortnite. Instead, he got to start playing games like Minecraft, Rocket League, and CSGO. Now, most of these games had some sort of competitive side to it, which he needed to scratch that competitive itch he had. But when Fortnite would finally be released, there was no competitive side to it quite yet. However, since the game was so massive, he obviously had to start playing, and well, he really enjoyed it and quickly became pretty good. With that being said, over the next 2 years, he never committed to fully grinding Fortnite until a pivotal moment where his professional Fortnite career would truly begin. And that was in February of 2019 when Epic Games would announce the Fortnite World Cup. And with a massive $30 million up for grabs, everybody wanted in on it. Before this announcement, Tayson was pretty good, but would just be considered slightly above average and was just playing for fun. But when he found out just how much money was on the line, his mindset completely changed, and instead of thinking of gaming as just a fun pastime, he wanted to seriously pursue it full time. With all that being said, he still had some serious improvement to make if he wanted to even have a slight chance of making it. So Tayson started grinding harder than ever before, fixing any mistakes he could and learning from each mistake in order to prepare for the World Cup qualifiers. The big way he would do this was by looking back at all of his previous deaths and making sure he did not replicate the same mistakes over and over again. Looking at his early videos, it was clear he had improved a ton, but what really stood out in his gameplay already was that despite still being quite mechanical for the time, it was mainly his fighting IQ and smart plays he would make that separated him from the competition, and later on he would hone in on these skills. However, for the time being, he was still nowhere near the top players. But before you knew it, the World Cup qualifiers were here, and it was time to see if all that hard work in such a short amount of time would actually pay off. And well, to sum it up, yes and no. Tayson would never actually get close to qualifying, with his best placement being a 100th in duos and 157th in solos. However, he still placed decently well in the other qualifying weeks, earning himself a few $1,000s, which is nothing to scoff at. Seeing his hard work actually pay off into real money, despite not qualifying, was another big eye-opener, and if he kept up this hard work, he might actually be able to one day play on a global stage. But little did he know, things in the future wouldn't go exactly as he hoped, but we'll get to that later on. After the hype of the World Cup, Epic Games announced an FNCS every season, and that the game mode would start off with trios. Now, during this first season of FNCS, Tayson and his trio wouldn't see much success. However, Tayson in solos was a completely different story. This was the first season where solo catch cups were held, and they had a really good prize pool, meaning if you were good at solos, you could rack up some serious cash, and that's exactly what he would do. It was also around now where he would start playing in as many scrim matches as he could, and this would end up being the key to his success now and especially later on. Tayson played as many scrim matches as possible to put him in situations similar to tournaments. Doing this over and over again allows him to get practice in pretty much every single situation he could find himself in an actual tournament, so he would always have somewhat of a good idea what to do in tricky positions. And in later seasons, it would be the best way to perfect the meta and also continue to give himself as much practice as possible. This is where he would start to perfect his unique playstyle of careful and methodical decision making, rather than being more flashy. After consistently making some money in solos, Tayson was starting to get his name out there as a respectable player to watch out for, and headed into chapter 2, he was going to make sure every single person in the scene knew his name. This time around, FNCS was squads, and he would perform much better, but sadly he would end up just barely missing out on making his first grand finals. However, this was a massive improvement, and the fact that he continued to consistently place in solos was really important for him getting more recognized in the scene. But it would actually be next season, in chapter 2 season 2, where his life would completely change forever. Up until this point, he had earned thousands from the game, yet he hadn't been able to make a grand finals or really even place within the top 5 or 10 in any event. However, this was all about to change. Tayson obviously had an insane amount of potential, and with the new game mode being duos, everyone was looking for a partner. And that's when Janice noticed how good he was. Now most of you probably recognize Janus, but at the time he had yet to make a name for himself. However, he had a ton of better placements than Tayson, but one very important thing they both had in common was their grind and work ethic. Now keep in mind, this was also when COVID had just hit, meaning everything had shut down, so they had all the time in the world to play. And since they were just teenagers, they'd make sure to take advantage of it. Now what would make both of these players become some of the best later on was that they needed to consistently be improving, and together that is exactly what they would do, playing in as many scrims as possible, VOD reviewing other top teams, and coming up with new strategies nobody's ever thought of. And in just a few weeks of being teammates, they would prove just how good they were, winning the FNCS warm-up finals. And this would actually be Tayson's first time winning an event ever. This only fueled the fire, and before they knew it, they played so well throughout the qualifier weeks that they had made it to semifinals and won their heat, qualifying Tayson to his first FNCS Grand Finals. Yet, despite this dominance throughout the season, when the finals came around, they would be contested, so in the end they'd place 33rd. But for his first Grands, that's not bad at all. However, this wasn't the only FNCS this season. There was also the solo FNCS Invitationals, and like I've said time and time again, he's been very consistent in solos. Now these last two seasons, Tayson was just starting to solidify his signature playstyle, but now he was starting to perfect it. With him, there was no need to be flashy, just kill your opponent as fast as possible and move on. It was almost robotic just how mechanical he was with every decision. That's how calculated they were. However, despite consistently placing in most solo catch cups, like I said, he was still struggling to break into the top 10 most of the time. But with his massive tournament coming up, of course he was going to continue grinding as much as humanly possible, honing in on those skills and being one of the smartest players in the world, yet nobody knew it yet. To make a long story short, Tayson would play the best Fortnite he's ever played during this tournament, making the finals where he placed 5th, taking home $50,000 at the young age of 15. This was obviously life-changing and would solidify to himself that all his hard work wasn't for nothing, and that if he kept going, he could someday become one of the best players in the world and make his dream of becoming a professional gamer as a job a reality.
By the way, if you made it this far into the video, double check that you're subscribed because not many of you are, and it really helps me out.
After this insane season, just a few weeks later was season 3, but Tayson would be over the moon when FNCS was announced to be solos. Obviously, coming off of his last performance, he was hoping to do even better. Now, I've mentioned how he had been grinding scrims and everything he can time and time again, but this was the season where he would truly lock in and start playing 10 plus hours a day. Tayson was determined to win. Throughout the season, he had some good placements, however, they weren't super consistent, and even though he won his FNCS heat and was now in Grands, nobody knew how he would do. But Tayson was confident in his skills. He had been grinding arguably more than any single other person in the entire game, and he was going to make sure that everyone knew who he was. Tayson would do it. He was clearly the best on the day and in dominant fashion won his first ever FNCS Grand Finals, taking home $80,000, bringing him from just an above average pro to one of the best in the world, all within a few months. Now at the top of his career with this insane achievement, some players would get too comfortable and slowly start falling off over time. But as you all know, Tayson didn't let this happen. He was still as hungry as ever and arguably even more to keep winning after getting just a taste. However, things were going to shake up going into season 4. Throughout his career, Tayson struggled more in team game modes and thrived in solos where it was just him and he could focus on himself. But with trios now being announced as the new main game mode for the rest of the chapter, he needed to switch his mindset and playstyle to adapt more to a team player. Many were curious to see who would be fortunate enough to get Tayson on his team, but nobody was ready for one of the most iconic seasons in competitive history with an iconic trio. That being Tayson alongside the Fortnite legends Mongrel and
and Mitro. With the mechanical abilities of Mongrel and Mitro teamed up with the brains of Tayson, this was an insanely good trio on paper, and they would begin to back this up even more after placing well in most of their tournaments together. However, there was a bit of a problem. Mongrel and Mitro had very energetic and out there personalities, which made them so good and entertaining. But as you all know, Tayson is quite the opposite, being very reserved and methodical, which would lead to them at times clashing a bit. This being said, they all still obviously tried their best, and after breezing through the qualifiers, it was almost time for the grand finals. But there was one main reason why they had been dominating so much throughout this season, and it's something I haven't mentioned yet. Somehow, they were able to lock down Stark Industries, which is one of the best drops we've ever seen in the entirety of Fortnite. So obviously this season it was the best. Since they had this drop locked down, many thought they would be able to win. However, it's Fortnite and anything can happen at the end of the day. But now, we were about to see if Tayson could make history and become the first player in the entire world to take the crown back to back.
I need to use a big. Just wait. Let's go! Let's go!
Bouncer.
Dead, one dead.
Even though they would get heavily contested on day 2, Tayson, Mongrel, and Mitro would come out on top, winning FNCS, submitting Tayson as the first ever player to win 2 titles in a row. But even though this trio had just won, Tayson still wanted better. I mentioned how their personalities clashed, and since Mongrel and Mitro streamed pretty much everything, they'd like to have more fun. However, Tayson wasn't thrilled that they weren't taking things super seriously, so this led to him deciding to split, hoping to continue this win streak with another trio. However, this decision would not end so well. Tayson would end up playing with Mr. Savage and iDrop, who were both phenomenal players. However, they would end up placing 8th in Grands, which was a major upset considering the following couple placements Tayson had. Heading into Season 5, he would switch teammates again, this time playing with Nate and 4ZR, who might sound unfamiliar to those who haven't been in the competitive scene for long, however just know that these two were very good players back then. And together, this trio would have a much better performance, placing 3rd. So even with that one Grands not going his way, his track record up to this point has been phenomenal. But right around the corner in Season 7 was the FNCS that would cement his legacy, the FNCS Solo All-Star Showdown. Tayson has already proved that he was both an amazing team and solo game mode player. However, he most definitely shined more by himself. And this time with an even bigger prize pool, he was going to make sure he would win. Since he had already qualified the finals by placing well in the previous FNCS, he would team up with Coach Destiny Jesus and other top pros in a private Discord server to figure out the best strategies to give them the most advantage over everybody else. And of course, this also meant playing tons of scrims. Tayson worked day and night, perfecting his game plan, and when the day finally came to play, he was going to make sure nobody would doubt his abilities ever again. But nobody expected this tournament to end the way it did. So far throughout this tournament, there had only been 2 players at the top of the leaderboard, Vino and Tayson. These two were neck and neck, and up until the final game, they were just a few points away from each other. And not only were they neck and neck on the leaderboard, they were also in the exact same Discord server together, which made things that much closer. So headed into the final game, we were about to see one of the most iconic endings in FNCS history.
The 2 names you have to be focusing on right now. Tayson is literally the world of hurt, but at the same time finds 2. Have to be Vino going for the win right now in order to catch up. He's going for Erkin as well. If he gets 3, that could be it. He's moving forward, forcing the placement. Tayson on all walls, but he sees everything through. Finds it. A big matchup. Tayson takes them all.
In the final moments, with one singular shot coming between Tayson winning and losing, luckily for him, he was on the winning side, crowning himself the 3-time FNCS champ, and of course earning $150,000 in the process. At this point, Tayson's name would get thrown around in the argument of who was the best player in the entire world. Now, even though we had just had a solo FNCS, this same season also had a trio one, which would go pretty well, and despite him not winning, he would place 5th alongside Rizon and Vino, who he had just beat. However, there was a bit of drama with this team throughout the season because Vino actually ended up getting banned because he bought his account a while back, which meant he had to make a completely brand new one and work up the ranks from there. So yeah, like I said, this definitely caused some problems, and even though a 5th to Tayson seems pretty bad, it really isn't in the grand scheme of things. With that being said, going into Season 8, Tayson would drop Vino and pick up Chapix, but unfortunately, this would end up being his worst FNCS yet, ending in 16th, which nobody saw coming, despite them being uncontested. After this performance, Tayson was at the lowest point in his career since he had first started gaining momentum. Going from constantly placing at the top to having 2 lackluster performances in his eyes really hit him hard. And even though everybody thought of Tayson as AI or robot-like since he didn't really show too much personality, he was still human at the end of the day, and this got to him. However, legends are made out of times like these. When you're down, it's important to get back up, and that is exactly what Tayson did. Despite everything that had just happened, he still kept his head up, and that was mainly because the same season, the FNCS Grand Royale was coming up, and with a massive prize pool, Tayson was more motivated than ever to prove to everybody who called him washed that he was still the best. During this event, he decided to keep playing with Chapix and pick up Hen, an underrated player who had quickly become one of the best fighters in the world. However, many still questioned this choice since Hen had not fully proved himself yet in FNCS. That being said, he was still clearly a phenomenal player, and considering he had already played with Chapix a lot, Hen seemed to be a perfect fit. Leading up to the finals, there weren't many trio cups, but in the few that there were, this team placed very well, so coming into the finals, many had high hopes, but were still cautiously optimistic. But little did everyone know, this trio was going to prove to every single person who doubted them that they were the best in the entire world.
Second height, second height.
Okay.
You will? Nice, you killed him. Good buddy. Nice. I'm cheering for this. Let's go! You guys are so good. Dead. They have peppers as well. 120 on him. Dead. Killed one. Second height.
Get the kill.
Edit, destroy. Do that. Right. 200. Dead. Let's go! Baby. Yeah, we get the match. Second height. No match. Dead.
Dead.
Nice. On me. Dead.
40. That's good.
On me. Right here. Dead. Let's go, baby. Let's go.
Tayson would win again, breaking his bad performance streak and becoming a 4 times FNCS champion, undoubtedly putting him in the conversation of who is the GOAT of Fortnite. We're now wrapping up 2021, and these last few seasons completely changed Tayson's life forever. Over the last 2 years, he went from a nobody to arguably the best player in the world with over $750,000 earned and 4 FNCS titles under his belt, all at the age of 17. But he wasn't even close to being done. At this point, at the end of Chapter 2, Tayson had become a name every single person in the scene knew. His socials were massive, and he was at the top of his game. Tayson had achieved not only his dreams, but the dreams of millions of others out there. At this point, some would get complacent and start to go a bit downhill. We've seen this happen time and time again with other pros. However, Tayson still had one massive goal he wanted to achieve: winning a LAN event. It's one thing to win online, but completely different in person, with the pressure of being on stage in front of a crowd. Since everything was online because of COVID when he started making a name for himself, Tayson was declared easily the GOAT of online tournaments and possibly ever. But if he was able to get that win at an international event, there would be no doubt in anyone's mind. And he didn't know it quite yet, but he would finally get an opportunity to prove himself very soon. Headed into Chapter 3, everyone had massive expectations for him, which were really unrealistic since in Fortnite anything can happen, but this didn't matter to him. He was always really good at focusing on himself and his teammates rather than what anybody else had to say, and that's exactly what made him the best. For many, it's hard to be good in multiple game modes, but clearly Tayson had no problem for this. However, up until now, there hadn't been many duo tournaments. So with the announcement that Chapter 3 was going to be switching from trios to duos for the entire year, everyone was anxiously waiting to see if he could check off another game mode he won FNCS in. Another question on everyone's mind was, who would he actually play with coming off of this huge win? Most expected it to be a previous teammate or another FNCS champion, and well, they would be right since it would be a previous teammate. However, he never played an FNCS with this player yet, and that was Thomas HD. At this point in Thomas's career, he was famous for placing extremely high in FNCS, but still never winning one yet. Back in Chapter 2, there were some DreamHack events that were duos, and in these events they would play together. Now, they never did perform at the very top in these events, but these two had grown a lot as players individually and as team players over time. On top of that, they already had chemistry, so it just made sense for them to team up. Now, without boring you all with random placement details any longer, in Season 1 FNCS, they'd end up placing 3rd together. After another phenomenal placement, Tayson's career could have not been going better. He was dominating every tournament, and he was ranked the #1 player in the world. But in Season 2, something would happen that almost ruined his reputation. In the last 3 seasons, Tayson placed 5th, 1st, and 3rd. Being this consistent, it was obvious another win was to come. That's when the unthinkable happened. Tayson and Thomas would announce they were splitting. Everyone was in shock. This was in the middle of the season, so why would one of the best duos in the world split out of nowhere? And well, the reason was pretty dumb looking back at it. So at the time, there were solo cash cups where the top 100 players in opens would compete in a set lobby for prize money. At this chapter, Tayson and Thomas were landing Rave Cave in duos, so obviously they went there in solos. But one fateful tournament, they would both qualify, and on the drop map, they chose the exact same drop, which was a 50-50. Obviously, this isn't something you want in solos since you only have 6 games to do your best. But most thought since they were teammates, one of them would leave, right? Well, no, both of their egos were way too big to leave, and they'd end up contesting each other, leading to a bunch of beef between them. Then when the tournament was all said and done, Tayson would finish in 61st and Thomas in 10th. Then not too long after, they would both make a post saying that they were looking for a new duo. So yeah, to make a long story short, because they contested each other in one single solo cash cup, they would end up splitting. And after this, Tayson would end up duoing with Chapix. Many were curious to see how they would place, given Tayson had been on such a dominant streak, and the last time they played together, they had won at FNCS. And while they wouldn't disappoint, placing 2nd. For those who are curious, Thomas HD would finish right below them in 3rd. It was really this tournament here that solidified to the entire world that he wasn't going anywhere, and he was almost undoubtedly the best in the entire world, making him the GOAT of Fortnite. However, this is also where everything would start to crumble. Season 3 would be the first FNCS in a very long time where he wouldn't perform well, however it wasn't really his fault. This season they decided to drop at a split in the middle of the map, which was pretty good, however it was far from the best. And despite the caliber of this duo, they would end up getting contested. Now this drop was the definition of a 50-50, and unfortunately out of the 12 games they would die all spawn 5 of them. And the times they did live, those matches were quite lackluster. Because of this, they ended in 23rd. This was very unfortunate, but Tayson was still able to keep his head up high. Everyone has bad performances every now and again, and we've literally seen Tayson bounce back from something like this. But soon, nobody would be thinking about this season. And that was because in Season 4, he was finally about to get his first chance to officially complete all of his dreams and solidify himself forever as Fortnite's one and true GOAT. After 3 years, Epic Games would announce the first official in-person event since the World Cup, the FNCS Invitationals. In this event, the top players throughout the entire globe would get invited to play on a stage against each other, competing for $1 million. So obviously, Tayson would get invited to play alongside Chapix. Now, despite this technically being the first official LAN event, it wasn't actually his first LAN. That was because just a few months prior, Gamers 8 would host their own World Cup type tournament for the Esports World Cup. Funny enough, this event actually had a higher prize pool than the FNCS Invitationals, and in the Builds tournament, Tayson would get 6, which is very respectable. However, like I said, this event wasn't technically an official one, and not everyone was playing with their actual teammates. For example, Tayson actually ended up playing with Thomas HD. And this happened in July of 2022, and at the time, they had already been split for a few months, and Tayson was still playing with Chapix. So that being said, it wasn't necessarily held to as high of a standard as FNCS, despite most players in that lobby being top FNCS contenders. With the hype of the Invitational coming, every single team who was invited started practicing like crazy. Everybody wanted to be crowned the LAN champ. There was a ton of anticipation leading up to this event, since many of the players competing had never played on a stage like this, going up against OGs like Booga who played back in the World Cup days. And Tayson is a prime example of this, having his come up during the lockdown era of competitive, becoming one of the best in the world during that era. However, he was never really able to prove that he was the best since there were no international events. But now, that was all about to change. However, things would not go how Tayson expected. There were countless teams who viewers thought would win, and amazing storylines to back it up. For example, Miro and Bugha dominating this chapter, and the possibility of him winning back-to-back lands, or maybe Vino and Queasy, who also had an extremely dominant chapter, and many more like Tayson who viewers thought could possibly win. But unfortunately, Tayson never got the opportunity to fight with the other big dogs at the top of the leaderboard. This was because of his off-spawn situation. The FNCS Invitationals happened in Chapter 3 Season 4, and this season a new POI, Cloudy Condos, would come out. And well, it was easily one of the best drops on the map, so Tayson and Chapix tried to lock it down. But they weren't the only ones. Both Merstash and Malabuka and Aqua and Raison would decide to go here too. If you guys know anything about these three teams, then you know they are all phenomenal fighters, and not only that, they also have a reputation for not leaving their drop spot. To keep things sweet and short, since they fought off spawn every game and were in a really bad spot on the map where teams could easily hold them in zone, they would end up dying off spawn 5 out of the 12 games. And when all was said and done, they only managed to get one single top 10. This really sucked for Tayson. After putting in tons of effort, blood, sweat, and tears, placing 32nd in his first ever LAN event, where he was one of the favorites to possibly win, was pretty crushing. And now everybody was starting to change their mind about him. In Fortnite, it's common you'll see somebody dominate, then they might have a bad tournament, and everybody will just call them washed. And these comments might have started to get to him. But wait, this is Tayson. He wasn't labeled the GOAT for no reason, and in Chapter 4, he was going to prove to every single person who doesn't believe in him wrong. And this started with one single teammate switch, and funny enough, it was actually a player who had just contested him at LAN, Merstash. Merstash is known as being one of the best fighters in all of Europe, and had just made a name for himself in that last chapter alongside his long-term duo Malabuka after placing 4th and 2nd during FNCS. This duo seemed to form at the perfect time because it was just around now where players were starting to change their mentality on different roles someone would play. Most of you know that the typical roles in a team are the IGL, support, and fragger. Now, since Tayson had always been very methodical in his gameplay and would spend tons of time figuring out game plans beforehand, he would end up naturally falling into the IGL role. But now pros had simply gotten so insane that these roles weren't needed anymore because at the top level they were so good that they could just do whatever was needed of them. Merstash was a perfect example of this. He could be flashy and wipe out a few duo in seconds if needed, but he can also chill out, call good rotations, and tarp ahead for them. This is exactly what Tayson needed to breathe more and play the game how he wanted to. Let's just say he would not disappoint. Throughout Chapter 4, they decided to land North Slappy Shores, which was one of the best drops on the map. And even though this meta for Season 1 was very messy since this season introduced the Shockwave hammers which made endgames very chaotic, they were able to consistently place at the top during the Elite Cups, which were the Cash Cups back then. And for the 1 millionth time, because of his performance throughout the season, him and Merstash were one of the favorites to win. But that being said, his last couple placements started to come back to him. He had been the favorite many times before and had fallen very short, just look at the last few seasons. So would he actually be able to come back and prove everybody wrong? Well, we were about to see if he could do just that, and nobody expected it to finish with a singular point difference.
100. 1 HP. Nice. Dead. 30 right. Look. Dead. Another guy. Stay ahead. Above, careful. On me. Nice. There's. 6 dead. He's in cone. Nice. I'm hammering up. Dead.
Tayson would do it again, winning 5 FNCSs, this time beating out his old teammate Thomas HDE by one singular point. This win here would solidify Tayson as the GOAT of Fortnite. He was the only player to ever win this many times in a big region, and the only players who had more wins than him back then were Arkram and Epic Whale over on NA West. This new duo was clearly going to be really hard to beat, and everyone was very excited to see how Season 2 would play out for them. However, when it was time to play Grands, nobody expected them to lose by such a large margin. Don't get me wrong, they played fantastic, getting 2nd. In fact, they had almost the same amount of points as last season when they won. Now you're probably confused why I said that they got beat so bad. Well, if anyone remembers this season, you'll remember that Queasy and Vino were the names everyone was talking about. This season's meta played perfectly into their playstyle. With the kinetic blade, Queasy was able to sit up on height with the heal off almost every single game, and Vino would just go down and kill the rest of the lobby. With that being said, they would go on to win 6 out of the 12 games, and possibly even more if they didn't troll, since they knew that they had the win in the bag at that point. If you guys have been watching me for a while, you'll know that I made a video on Tayson over 2 years ago, and this was the season season we ended off on. At this point, it was hard to deny that he was the GOAT. Over the last 3 years, he had been at the top, winning 5 FNCSs, placing second twice and third 3 times, accumulating well over $1 million earned. Yes, he hadn't been able to prove himself at LAN yet, but in his defense, the odds were stacked against him, and being so dominant in the best region in the world for this long speaks volumes. With that being said, after this season, his career would take a very drastic and dark turn. During Season 3, Tayson started to not play as much since he wasn't enjoying the season, and this would show in their results. They really struggled to get Surge, and since they were still at Slappy Shores, which was edge of the map, teams started holding them in zone, which would cause them to finish in 15th at Grands. This was obviously very disappointing, however it wasn't very surprising since they hadn't been playing as much. However, he did have a chance to redeem himself in Season 4, where Tayson got his second chance to prove himself at LAN during the Global Championship. But without dragging out this season, let's just say it ended in disappointment, with them falling into a similar problem to last season, and with this tournament only being 6 games, every match counted. However, they once again ended in 15th, just not being able to bring it all together during the end games. But again, in their defense, this was the Rocket Ram meta, which was very crazy. However, that being said, it was very similar to Hammer season where they won FNCS. So you can't blame everything on the metas. Unfortunately, once again, Tayson would fall short at LAN, despite playing much better than last time. Tayson was now at another low point, but we've seen him come back from this time and time again. After all, we're going into a new chapter, and he's still considered the GOAT, right? Well, not quite. There's been a bit of a pattern in Tayson's performances over the years, and it plays out like this. Essentially, the seasons that he enjoys, he grinds more, therefore doing better in Grands, but the ones he doesn't enjoy playing as much makes him not want to get on, so he just doesn't, which causes him to perform worse. You might be thinking, well, why doesn't he just grind and continue to do well? However, that's a lot easier said than done. When you've been playing for so long, it's hard to maintain the same passion from when you started, despite him still being one of the best in the world. And everyone knows, Fortnite has had some really bad seasons, which makes grinding even harder to do. So to put it simply, Tayson was getting a bit burnt out, and to prevent total burnout, he would start playing less often. And unfortunately, this pattern would start back up again in the first part of Chapter 5. Even though he played with Vino, who despite also having a disappointing Globals performance was still one of the best in the region, he continued to struggle. Once again placing 15th and then 11th in Season 1 and 2. This streak of poor performances was something we haven't seen from Tayson pretty much since he started playing. Yes, he had a few bad seasons here and there where he didn't do as well as he hoped, but having 4 in a row where he underperformed, it was looking like Prime Tayson was officially over. Now, not to say these placements are bad at all by any means, in fact, these would be really good placements to most other pro players. However, this is Tayson. We've gone over and over again about his top placements and why he's so good, so to him and to everybody else, these placements just don't really cut it for him, unfortunately. However, there was one last hope for him. Chapter 5 Season 3 was the last chance he had to qualify for the 2024 FNCS Global Championship, but in order to try and qualify, we would see him do something he had never done in his entire career, and that was to switch regions. Now, in order to qualify on EU, he needed to place within the top 10 duos in the grand finals, who also hadn't qualified yet. Now, this seemed pretty doable for someone of his skill. However, after playing very poorly throughout this chapter, Vino would decide to split with Tayson, which left him with not many good duo options since all of the other teams had either already qualified or had a good duo. This is when he looked over to NA. Here, there was the exact same amount of qualifier spots as there was on EU. And for the most part, NA Grands is considered a little bit easier, but the main reason he decided to move to a completely different continent for his last chance at LAN was his teammate. There were some pretty good players on NA who also hadn't yet made it, and one of those was Yamzo. Many of you probably recognize him from playing with Clicks, but back then he had just split with his longtime duo Rise. Yamzo was this insanely good fighter, and despite him having a very different personality to Tayson, this duo would officially form to the shock of many. Together, they were playing extremely well throughout the season, even winning the last duo Cash Cup before Grands. So everyone thought that they had this in the bag, and even predicted them to easily place in the top 5. But when time came to actually play, they would crumble under the pressure, with Tayson having a curse of getting 15th. Everybody was shocked. Tayson, the Fortnite legend since Chapter 2, didn't qualify for the Global Championship, meaning this was going to be the first Grands where we didn't see Tayson compete in all the way since Chapter 2 Season 1 squads. And what possibly threw a little bit more salt into the wound was not only did Vino go over to NA and qualify, but because of visa issues during the LAN, Yamzo would get invited as a backup player, so he still got the chance to play at LAN. Now, I'm not 100% sure if Tayson could have played but chose not to, but still this had to have hurt. And it was now where Tayson had officially been dethroned as the GOAT. Of course, he is still considered in the conversation, but after being consistent for so long, it was clear he was now not enjoying the game as much. But it's not actually over for Tayson's story yet. This was hands down his worst chapter yet, but currently he has started to dominate again. Many thought we might see him retire after everything, but of course, this is Tayson, and he didn't get that GOAT title for no reason, like I've said time and time again. Chapter 6's FNCS game mode would go back to trios, and he would decide to pick up Chicho and Trulex, who are also extremely good and underrated pros on Europe. Together, this trio managed to play 7th, 7th, and 5th throughout this chapter. This is definitely improvement compared to last chapter, but most importantly is that with these performances, he qualified himself to the 2025 Global Championship coming up this year. And so far, this season's looking really good for him. He's been going up against Fredoxy, who had just won FNCS the season prior, and is currently dominating him while spawn. And at the time of me making this, the finals hasn't happened yet, but it's safe to say Tayson is back to the grind, and maybe, just maybe, this time he can finally achieve the only accomplishment he has yet to earn in his career, and that's the title of Global Champion. However, this year, it's not looking likely. With everything being said, Tayson is still a top competitor and is by no means a bad player, but with the constant inconsistency as of late, especially when it comes to LAN events, it's hard to call him the GOAT at this moment, especially when you have the rise of players like Peterbot and Poyo. Everybody thought Tayson's consistency was insane back then and would never be beaten, but these two shattered everybody's expectations of what a player can achieve in Fortnite, easily having the most dominant streak we've seen, with them both winning almost everything together and on their own. Plus, it still looks like there's no stopping for either of them. And with 2026 most likely being duos again and them officially saying that they're going to play together, it doesn't seem like anybody's going to take their throne anytime soon. So even though I think it's impossible to refuse that Tayson has been dethroned with Peterbot now taking that spot, he is still very much in the conversation, at least when talking about who is the GOAT of Fortnite, and will without a doubt go down as one of the best to ever do it, solidifying Tayson as a Fortnite legend. Thank you all so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed, please consider leaving a like and subscribe. This video took me a very long time to make, and we're almost at 100k subs, so it would mean the world to me. I hope you all have an amazing rest of your days. Peace out.